Welcome to the Ad.Dot podcast. Today I have Matt McLarty with me. He is the field CTO of MuleSoft. And so you can imagine we're going to talk about APIs and also, the kinds of, more the category of tooling that Matt has experience with and also in helping clients and how that crosses paths with DDD and other specific ways of implementing software architecture and so forth. So welcome to the podcast, Matt. Thanks for joining me.
Yes, Vaughn. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So can you tell us just a bit about what you do as a field CTO at MuleSoft?
Yeah, definitely. What's funny about the title, right? Chief Technology Officer is I guess field CTO is sort of an understood industry term now, but I would say these days it's not so much working with companies on technology, right? I mean, not deep into the technology per se. I joined MuleSoft in 2019 with a focus on API strategy, which is really helping companies leverage APIs in any way for how they could drive business value or drive more productivity in their organizations by adopting API first approaches. But really, very much kind of on the business side of things. And it's just that because that seems to be very central to what matters to companies now. I think everybody's a little more familiar with the tech challenges around using APIs. The real challenges are around how do you do that and drive more business value. So I've just taken a more central role in helping organizations digitally transform or trying to sort of move into the new ways of working. So I'm generally working with large organizations in all industries around the globe, and there's a lot of similarities in the profile of big organizations who are just trying to deal with all the complexity and opportunity that exists out there in the distributed software landscape.
So what is your background in APIs? I mean, my background goes back to the Windows API way back, late 80s, early 90s. And that was sort of the first era, I think, of when I thought about API. There was also the OS2 API, the SDK, and so forth. So, that was kind of my introduction. I think it's kind of taken on a whole new meaning today, though. We're not talking about libraries of stuff.
No, completely. And in fact, when I talk to companies, I usually sort of start with let's define what API means because there were APIs. I think the term originated probably in the 60s on the mainframe, right? And then I know the first APIs I was writing to were on the Tandem platform, which is now like a nonstop platform with really deep code. But I think now, in general, we talk about APIs. We're talking about web APIs, and even those though have evolved, right? I think I started my career writing, payments type software for a big bank here in Canada, but quickly got into this sort of integrated network-based communication, which at that time, mid '90s, was doing things like between bank transactions, VisaNet transactions. So still sort of integrating third parties. When the web came, and then especially when web services were an early concept, so XML came out, 1999, and then SOAP started being popularized around 2002. I started getting into that for the same bank as we were looking for opportunities to drive new approaches for online banking, new service opportunities. And what was interesting there is, the technology was very much evolving out of the internet, the web domain, and web services themselves were originally intended to be, hey, let's connect all these organizations, and you had, stock quote type examples were early on for SOAP APIs, but at that time, what I would find out later was pretty representative of where a lot of organizations were. The big challenges were just even integrating internally. And so those those SOAP web services that were becoming popular were sort of hijacked and brought inside the organization. And so we were early adopters of service-oriented architecture and using SOAP services to connect internal systems. But then still, the web stuff still went on. And I think around 2005, 2006 were the big religious wars of SOAP versus REST. And, hey, look at what you can do if you use HTTP-based protocol features to integrate. It makes things so much nicer than having to deal with the heavyweight SOAP protocol. So, eBay and Salesforce and others were pioneers of sort of RESTful APIs, and then that became a big deal. I think the explosion there really happened around when mobile hit the scene, because then it was okay. We may think of the iPhone or mobile device as being the big deal, but it's actually all the services behind those apps that make them really valuable, which we all recognize if you ever lose network connectivity on your phone, right? There's not a whole lot you can do. So at that time I was still, it had moved into the software vendor side, working for IBM, and was helping organizations with that internal integration challenge, but was also observing that, hey, all that stuff that was supposed to happen with web services was now happening with RESTful APIs, and was really powering mobile and then social and even more. And we started to see the early API product companies like Twilio and Stripe and so on. And so then I joined another startup here in Vancouver and actually created a group called the API Academy, where we realized that there was all these companies who were trying to take advantage of these opportunities, either inside or outside, for connecting to third parties. And we were just helping them with API strategy, architecture, design. And then that's just continued to grow. That was around 2012, and 10 years later, we're still seeing companies maturing, taking more opportunity. So what's nice now is I think the ideas that were early on saying, hey, you could do this, you're a big company, you could do this. Now we're starting to really see that take hold more commonly across these big companies.
So in that kind of you refer to it as a war, mid like 2005 kind of time frame. Do you think that was won because developers finally chose, or do you think that the overwhelming force of large companies in a certain direction, and they were just hiring more people? Like what is it that actually was the decider, do you think?
Yeah, I think it was developers, but I think it's especially developers in the role of API consumers, right? And this is one of the big lessons that we've seen all along with APIs is people can obsess on the provider side and the server side and think, they get stuck in the weeds there. But at the end of the day, like, APIs are just tools that make developers' lives easier. They should be, right? I think there was a lot of stuff that happened in the SOAP space where there was, big vendor consortiums and over standardization. It became a big mess, which lost sight of, you actually have to have people use these things and understand how to use these things. And so there was certainly an organic element to the rise of RESTful APIs. And then I think what happened is, just because there were so many places then to apply this approach of, hey, well, we got these social networks. How are we going to connect them to things? Oh, well, we can use these APIs to do that. Oh, we've got mobile phones. Like, what's a good way to get information from the server side? Oh, well, if you just use HTTP and create some resources and take this RESTful interaction, it makes it simple. So because I think it was so easily understood by developers on the consumer side, and there's a lot of easy tooling on the server side, and I think it sort of coincided with the rise of Ruby on Rails as well, like in that community where you saw the RESTful, or at least the sort of, that's a whole other debate on what's REST and what's not REST, right? Like the pure definition of REST with hypermedia and so on versus the pragmatic, hey, just HTTP and some resources. But I think that just really popularized the spread. And then you had, and I think that's actually now, what's funny now is here we are in 2022, and there's another set of protocol religious wars going on about, you'll see articles about people saying like GraphQL is the greatest thing ever, and I ran across a company recently, I won't name them, whose architecture team has decided that they need to divest of REST and move to everything to GraphQL. Without, my first question is, okay, let me see the business case for that. But again, I think the ubiquity of RESTful, like just how easily it's understood. Hey, you need HTTP and you need some JSON to code the data. Away you go. I think has made it really powerful. I wrote a piece on that for InfoQ a couple of years ago, saying like, as much as we'd like to focus on these, get in the weeds of why this protocol for this specific use case is better than REST or whatever, I think you have to look at the whole. Say, well, would we have had the same mobile explosion if people couldn't easily provide services from the back end? Probably not. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not highly opinionated on most of this, but I do know that REST, or at least HTTP with resources, as you said, is really the most popular way, definitely by far, of developing APIs. We were asked to implement a GraphQL server for our Zoom platform, open source platform. And to me, I don't, again, have a strong opinion about it, but it seems to me like GraphQL is not REST, but it has a lot of REST type smells, right? I mean, you're still submitting requests over HTTP. At least that's how we support it.
I think if you see, I'm not even really denigrating GraphQL either. Like, I think everything has its use. And I think what I get irritated with is when people say, well, REST sucks because of this particular thing. And you find out it actually has nothing to do with REST. It's just the way people have been implementing, like stereotypical implementation patterns. So the GraphQL community will be like, well, GraphQL is great because you can actually aggregate all these different resources behind your single API. And well, you can actually do that with HTTP. And like, you don't, just because people have been maybe overly adhering to this idea that single resource, single endpoint type of thing. Well, you don't have to do it that way, right? And in fact, so I think that people can easily conflate issues with a protocol with issues with how it's being used. And then the risk there is you throw away the protocol and you move to a new protocol, but bring all the bad practices with you. So to your point, right? You can actually model APIs in GraphQL almost identically to the way you might model RESTful APIs. But I think the thing about GraphQL that maybe is a little unique is, well, it's not even entirely unique because you can use query parameters on HTTP as well. But there's a lot of focus on empowering the developers the consumers to say, you just pick the elements you want and away you go. But I think that brings a whole other set of risks as well around, okay, what's the performance profile? What's the change management impact of just letting consumers do whatever they want on the interface? So yeah, it's a big topic, but I did a QCon panel recently where it was set up to make it look like we were going to have a big religious debate between myself kind of representing the REST camp, and then you had someone from Twitter on the GraphQL and someone from Google on GRPC. But it ended up being very friendly and concluding, hey, it depends, right? It's like, what problem are you trying to solve?
Yeah, interesting. And that's always the case, right? If we're really being forthright about the different approaches, technologies, and so forth. What would you, interesting that you bring up the panel, including GRPC. Mm-hmm. I've seen a lot of tooling type companies move toward GRPC for various reasons, but I don't know that I see a groundswell with clients actually offering GRPC based APIs. What do you see?
Yeah, GRPC, obviously it's got Google origins. First of all, I have to say, like, I do always giggle a little bit with gRPC because I talked about my days as a tandem programmer, very low level stuff, almost somewhere between like C++ and assembler type coding. And the protocols that we would use there were very compressed and use bit mapping and so on. So when I see gRPC and protobuf, like it just reminds me of these old compressed formats with index numbers for fields and so on. I'm like, whoa, is this ASN1 all over again? But anyway, I mean, I think it's a really community-based thing. I think that gRPC has an affinity with Kubernetes, which is a pretty broad community of implementers. So anyone sort of in that CNCF ecosystem, Kubernetes ecosystem, will naturally be, aligned with gRPC and saying, okay, well, we need, this is kind of the native protocol for a lot of what's going on in Kubernetes now, so we should implement that. In terms of the open API world, like it's still very RESTful. We're seeing a little bit of GraphQL, although I think GraphQL is still more of a sort of full stack developer world where you want to. It has more of an affinity with the React community, right? It came out of Facebook, and so. But I think gRPC for open APIs, I haven't really seen that yet, other than really in a tight alignment with Kubernetes, and what we see is a lot of bridging, so we have to sort of. And what we're doing with our customers is we're bridging those worlds, right? Dealing with the React developers, working on the web UIs, and dealing with the external APIs and RESTful APIs, and then dealing with the underlying infrastructure on Kubernetes. So, I mean, I've spent a lot of times trying to articulate, sort of throwing all the technology aside, what are some patterns for integration that are protocol agnostic. And we see the same patterns implemented in all those areas, right? You still have queries, you still have sort of state changing commands, and you still have events that are more asynchronous and post state change in nature. And there's ways of modeling those in all the protocols.
Yeah. Let me broach a subject that is probably a little controversial, but, well, maybe more than a little, but from my standpoint, in a friendly way, I'd like to discuss. What do you think API first really means? It seems like such a sacred term, like, someone hears API first and they really, really have to do API first as if API drives everything. Yeah. What is the reality around API first?
I think if I unpack API first, I think that the origins would be that there's a lot of really badly designed APIs out there. I think that's where it starts, right? And so if you start to try and understand why are there so many badly designed APIs, it's just probably the common factor is people aren't really thinking about the developer experience, the consumer experience. So it's like the old everyone's on one side of the boat, let's all run to the other side of the boat thing, where I think the API first is about, hey, you should really think about your consumer. Like the reason you have an API is because somebody has a problem they need to solve. So help them solve that problem. And then from there, the design process should flow back to how you actually implement it, as opposed to what was happening a lot, and is still happening a lot, which is, oh, I have some data, let me run this wizard and it will create auto create some API for me, and then thinking that that's enough. Well, it's probably not optimized for the consumer side. But I think you raise a good point, right? Is what happens then if everyone becomes overly religious around API first, while it's probably slowing some stuff down, it's not necessarily the most practical thing. I think that just design and building, we know that there's this feedback loops all over the place, right? So I think in reality, it should be sort of, don't forget about API design, don't forget about the consumers, but there's still always this iterative and cyclical design process, I think, where, anything where you have to do everything up front from a design perspective and then everything cascades down feels very waterfally, right? So, but But I think the main thing I would get out of API first is really like, let's remember that APIs have consumers, and that ultimately that's what's going to drive the value of the APIs. But the other thing I would say is, on a more macro scale, I do think that in the level of complexity in a typical organization, software landscape is so high that you should, though, be really thinking about how you can not create more monolithic elements. And that, if we, without getting specific on what protocol you might use for an API, being able to have whatever business capabilities, application functions in your environment at a relatively granular level that people can call on, in an API type way, is clearly the right architectural approach these days. So I think I think I would also take API first as being a good thing in promoting that type of architecture, which is going to be more composable. That's what I spend a lot of time on that.
Yeah. And I think, yes, from the standpoint of APIs are very important. They need to be well designed with the, consumer experience, user experience in mind. I think I definitely agree with that. What concerns me is when people hear API first and they're already strongly into APIs, then they start to say, well, what that means is that enterprise architecture gets to decide what everybody in the company's services look like, because we're going to create these APIs in a vacuum. Well, we have some conversations with them, but we're interpreting what they need, and then we foist these, the outcome, whatever it happens to be, like open API, spec like Swagger, whatever specification, and then what they're going to do is model their domains after the APIs that we provide for them, and that is so short-sighted. And what I see is when that happens in a very large way, in the end, those who have that mindset will not be able to keep up with the amount of rejection that they're going to have, as in, this doesn't work, right? That you don't know what's going on inside, so you can create these, as enterprise architects tend to do, in this sort of ivory tower, right? Mm-hmm. And then everybody else deals with it. And what I've found in my own, experience in consulting is that they hand these specs over, like for APIs and architecture, and the solution architects just ignore it.
Yeah.
They just literally, it becomes this sort of big, money sink. And then in the end, they're like, we can't work with this. It's not real, So anyway, what's your experience there?
Totally agree. Well, I mean, it just reminds me of the sort of the canonical data model euphoria of the mid 2000s as well, right? Around that, like the SOA days of, I know what we need. Our enterprise needs a canonical data model, and everybody will have the same understanding. And how did that work out? Right? Not very well. In fact,
and that's one of my. It's funny because I guess the daylight hasn't reached certain places, where they're still using the term SOA. And I guess from a, sort of philosophical standpoint, even using microservices is kind of a service-oriented architecture, but it's not what SOA was, right? That's not what SOA was. But then, and of course, whenever you talk SOA, canonical data model comes along with it. And I'm just like, didn't anybody get the memo that stuff disappeared 15 years ago, or at least?
This is the thing about our industry that can be frustrating but fascinating, right? Is that there's just so much information. You don't know who's learned what lessons, and SOA as an acronym is a funny one to me, because we probably lived through the same experience of SOA being so much promise, and then being sort of hijacked by vendors, and all the integration broker vendors saying, "Oh yeah, we have an ESB," and I wrote a whole piece on that one for InfoWorld around how that story ran out. But what's interesting to me is if you go and talk to like people at Amazon or Netflix or Lyft or companies like that who are the microservice pioneers, they have no bones of, like, they call it service. We have a service oriented architecture. It doesn't have any of the sort of same SOA as a 4-letter word connotations to it, because I mean it is. And even microservices, I would even say the reason it was named microservices, I don't know this, but I would speculate it was, we just got to get away from the SOA label. But let's take what were the intended best practices of the origins of SOA and see if we can repackage it, notwithstanding there were some other elements on the kind of implementation side. But so I think all these movements in our industry, they always are so we know how it's going to go. They're going to get overloaded. They're going to get overhyped. People will miss the point, and and that probably is happening a little bit with the API first. Certainly has happened with microservices. I'm sure we're probably coming up pretty soon on when the next rebranding of SOA happens, and it's called something else. But I think that what I do in my role, like, is when I'm working with companies, it's a blind spot for me where I have to try and remember, like, not everyone's had the same experience I've had, and try and really understand when they say certain terms, what do you mean by that? Are you aware of this? The pitfalls here, kind of go in with the beginner's mind. You have to do that just because there's just so much information out there and people have different experiences.
For sure. So one thing that I learned in some conversation with you, I don't know, it's been maybe 6-8 months ago now, is that you were kind of the originator of the, was it called API Canvas or Web?
It was actually, there's a branding thing. It was a Microservice Design Canvas. Yes.
Okay.
So it was, and actually it's kind of a good follow on from the API first thing, because what you were just describing there, right, with enterprise architecture groups maybe getting a little over their skis on, as opposed to giving guidance, sort of higher level guidance to the organization, let's go design some API specs and make everyone implement them. Right. It was actually, and to what I was saying about this sort of feedback loop, iterative design process people go through, a problem I saw was, okay, microservices, one of the big ideas, and one of the big ideas of SOA and APIs, API first, and in the form I'm describing it, is you want to decouple the work. You want to be able to decouple what the providers are building and what the consumers are building. And if you wait to get to the spec level where everything is super well defined, you probably waste a lot of time, because if I'm on the consumer side, I don't have to know exactly what the spec is going to look like in order to start building what I'm building, right? But it would be nice to know what's going to be available to me down the road. So that was actually, I was doing an online course for O'Reilly on microservices in the enterprise. Like, how do we take what we've learned from these kind of startup-y digital native world and apply it in an enterprise context? And that was when we got into the stage of, okay, let's figure out what services you actually need, which was a lot of that was applying domain-driven design concepts, context mapping, and so on. Once you know what you need to build, then let's describe it in a way that can get everyone going. And so that, I thought, kind of had been embedded in a lot of lean canvas type stuff around that time. Thought, well, this would be a good format. If we just capture first of all, what jobs to be done are you trying to support, and then turn that into what type of interactions you might need to support, and then just capture the most important pieces of, what type of data is absolutely needed for that's unique, what type of rules you might need, and then what dependencies you'll have. Then that will at least get people going on the consumer side, and also be a good framing that you'll need for doing your development work on the actual service or the API that you're building. And I know it was actually it's something that I kind of did on that course and wrote a blog on it. And we had a colleague of mine who'd moved on to another company. They were using it. James Higginbotham and I, talked a lot about it. He took it and refined it. I know it's in the book that he just published in your signature series there. And Chris Richardson did a version of it kind of in the microservices world. So it's definitely something I wish I'd followed through a little more deeply on, but it's great to see it having legs in the community.
Right. And it's cool because you were early enough that you weren't just trending on it, right? It was early in the Canvas days, but shortly after that, like I recall, it's like everyone has a Canvas now, and it's like diet soda. This is my diet soda Canvas or something. Not that that's true, but it seems like that, right? It's like we don't have a Canvas, we don't, exist.
Yeah, I was just on a call with the architecture group behind the Built conference there. Yeah, they actually have a library of canvases, and I was a little disappointed that the service design canvas wasn't in there specifically, but it looked like there's some sort of ancestor or sort of children or grandchildren of the idea. But yeah, there are a lot of canvases out there, and what's funny is one of the things that I have a tendency to ideate and then maybe not follow through as much as I want to, but I am following through on one that I've discovered recently, which is business model canvas is great, and I think a lot of companies are using it, but I've started to do something in defining business models, which is something that you actually get into in this API world, because companies are trying to figure out what APIs should we build, should we externalize them, and so on. Is this the big thing I'm on now is this value exchange mapping or value dynamics. See, I can't even get the name straight, but which is all about kind of mapping out all the different stakeholders or constituents of a digital ecosystem and seeing what types of value they exchange. And I found this to be a really powerful way of coming up with visual business models that's very actionable. Whether you want to refine what you're doing or find new opportunities and gaps, it's a very visual thing. But that's more to come on that later, I guess.
Great. Sounds very interesting. So one thing I wanted to talk about is, as I recall, MuleSoft had its roots in ESB, right? I mean, that's what was their first product. And of course, I included that, pardon me, mostly because of influence from one of my reviewers and someone who contributed to my Red Book a little bit. And he was all jazzed on, MuleSoft ESB. So he wanted me to include that. And I think if you read the architecture chapter 4, you'll find that. And I think that got some of the early employees at MuleSoft really jazzed. They were like, oh, wow, Vaughn likes MuleSoft. And actually, I had never used it. I used other messaging, but I included it. So anyway, I'm glad that, I guess I can't take credit for the huge success of MuleSoft, but maybe a little bit of credit in there. But where is MuleSoft these days in messaging, right? Is everything a REST API, or do you still have not that it's an ESB, but some kind of messaging APIs too?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because my original experience with MuleSoft was when it was MuleSource, and I was at IBM, and the big incumbent. Hey, IBM had like 5 ESBs, ESB technologies, right? And it was like, well, who's this little upstart open source company? So MuleSoft's evolved a lot, and I think that what sets MuleSoft apart, and one of the things is, there's that heritage is all there. We still have lots of companies who struggle to crack open their SAP implementations and have them you play nice with the rest of the systems in their organization. And the reality of the way enterprise software goes, like you actually can't even retire or migrate anything unless you've actually appropriately encapsulated it anyway, right? The sort of strangler pattern. But MuleSoft was, and I don't take credit for this because I only joined in 2019, but MuleSoft was very smart in staying ahead of the market in the right direction. So I think in 2013, around then, having grown substantially as a developer-friendly ESP platform, because there was a lot of not very developer-friendly ESP platforms, recognized that APIs, this is the way companies were going to want to integrate, and that there's a lot more value in, instead of just wiring point A to point B, trying to encapsulate and modularize the architecture so that you would have these API-based business capabilities. That would be a much more scalable way of growing and transforming, and they've been proven right. But I think now, I've been acquired by Salesforce in 2018. We've done so much work with companies around helping them become more composable through this API-led approach to integration, that now, good news is we're at the point where, okay, once you have a whole bunch of composable things, what do you do next? So we're getting more into those next steps, whether that's automating and providing. We acquired an RPA company last year called Service Trace to help provide more immediate automation capabilities. We just launched a bunch of work around what we call universal API management, where now we can plug into other people's API gateways, not just MuleSoft. And I think that is sort of one of the big missing things, I think, in a lot of organizations, is just visibility. Like, what do I have? Or at least seeing what I have in my software landscape in a way that actually articulates it so I know what I have. And so that's a big, I think, probably an undersold part of the value proposition of what we try and do, which is just help you see what you already have and help you see it in a way that you can actually use it in all these different contexts. So there's a lot of evolution that keeps happening, and it's pretty exciting.
So how would I publish domain events to other microservices through a messaging mechanism? What is the MuleSoft answer to that these days?
Yeah, well, MuleSoft has its own sort of asynchronous protocol on AnyPoint MQ, but I mean, we have tons of customers who are implementing Kafka or RabbitMQ, whatever messaging protocol. So we're definitely taking the universal approach of whatever you have, we'll plug into it, and then we can surface those events, as capabilities in our exchange, which is the kind of the catalog of all the things that you've got in your organization, most of which would be APIs, but I still see sort of event interactions as a form of API. So really, however you'd be modeling it, it would show up in this catalog. And if you're a developer in the organization and you're like, oh, I need to get notified when there's new customer onboarding or something like that, I can subscribe to that event over here. We've launched some support for async API spec, which is Fran Mendez started that spec, which is, I think, really useful in terms of rounding out all the more event or sort of a protocol agnostic way of saying, look, you've got events in your organization, we can model them through async API the way you might through open API spec. So yeah, it's part of, we could sort of consider events to be just like APIs as part of the way that your systems are communicating.
Yeah, good. So, I guess talking about events or domain events in this case kind of leads to domain-driven design. I know that you've had some DDD has influenced your work, mm-hmm. and I just wonder how that fits into your day-to-day or month-to-month or something like that.
Yeah, I think there's a real, there's sort of a longevity to the concepts of DDD that make it very different from the other trends we see in the industry, right? Because it's really focused on the problem space mostly, right? And I think that, so I would say most companies that I'm working with, or most architectures or architects I'm working with, they're very much, they recognize that. And so I'd say the way it comes up day to day most is when we're working with companies, a lot of what we're doing is saying, okay, let's try and be specific and then generalize from there. And so we have a workshop where we would go into an organization and say, like, give us like 3 to 5 different initiatives or use cases or something where you can say, you know, maybe we're working on this project now, maybe we were envisioning this project in the future, and just give us what the customer experience is and what the underlying data and systems would be involved in that. And let's just walk through how you would actually model the integration architecture for that. Like, what APIs would you need? And so that's kind of the north-south, is you've got the user experience up here and the data and systems at the bottom. But the east-west is really the domains, where the domains come in. And so we really try and get people to understand, you know, use context mapping to have them understand that why it's important to figure out what the domains are involved in that interaction, because over time that's how you're gonna come up with the most effectively reusable and scalable services and components that will help you the next time you have an initiative. And when you actually plot multiple initiatives, especially on different timescales, it helps them to see that, because then you can sequence it and say, well, okay, in this domain, if you build these services first, then you're going to actually pave the road for the ones coming down the road. The other thing is, you know, there's a lot of sort of domain models or industry domain models out there now, which are I think a big risk area, in my opinion, where companies will, like in banking, might see the buy-in model and say, well, we're just going to adopt that and internalize it, which is dangerous, right? Because that was not developed from your business. And so even taking those sort of templates that are out there in the industry, you still need to go through good domain modeling if you're going to make it work for your organization. So we're doing that. And the other thing I'd say is, I've been working a lot with Salesforce. MuleSoft is part of Salesforce. And Salesforce has a whole group of field architects, enterprise architects, and they've actually developed a really comprehensive set of they call it capabilities, but really it's their own sort of domain model, which covers a full spectrum of industries, and so that's been a useful gauge as well. But I think people are recognizing that you know, you have to think about you have to forget about what application is delivering functionality, and you really do need a more domain specific view of your organization. And going back to what I was saying about the visibility problem, that's the way I think we articulate it for companies, is to say, you know, we're going to articulate what your systems do in terms of domains and capabilities within those domains. That's the right view that sorts things out on the IT side, but also puts it in terms business people understand. So it comes up a lot.
Yeah. And as long as it's recognized that capabilities are the what and processes the how, right? That okay, we have a, you know, whatever, treasury management, deposits, whatever, you know, capabilities. How are we going to design those actually, right? So, I think that Beyond is, or Bion, I'm not sure how people
pronounced.
Yeah. You know, I mean, it can give you a lot of ideas about capabilities you should consider having in a bank. But actually, I've looked quite a bit at their models, and I have to say I don't get much out of them. You know, they're I mean, in terms of capabilities, yes, but from a sort of API perspective, I guess I don't know that I would agree that these are the ways that, you know, a certain bank should do things. Yeah. So maybe that's what you were driving at.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a few issues there. I just try and when I encounter it in the wild, I say, you know, it's an input, right? You can, you know, people have put a lot of thought into how you would decompose banking into these process areas and capability areas, but it's not a shortcut. It's not something that you're just going to drop into your organization and all of a sudden you're composable. Like that doesn't work that way.
Well, and there's no code there, actually. I mean, there's a lot of contract there, but
and I think I don't even think there's like specific API specs or anything like that, which is probably a good thing, right? Like if there were, you could just see people just like, oh yeah, we're going to put it in there in the hopes of interoperability. But,
I don't want to be misunderstood. It's a laudable effort. It's amazing, really, that they came up with this. I have had experience with clients just saying like, well, let's just do this, you know, let's use the Beyond
you run into the same thing I do.
Models, and
you run into the same thing I do, right?
Yeah.
But that's
exactly.
the silver bullet. So, let's go.
Yeah, let's do it. So, okay, well, so in the whole digital transformation, I would say has become almost an industry in itself, you know, which is, I guess, your focus now. What are the biggest problems that you think companies are running into? What are the reasons that they're failing at transformation?
I mean, I think it's that there's a few areas. Like there was a study, I can't remember, was it IDC study? Someone did the numbers and said like we spent $1 trillion on digital transformation and 900 million of it didn't work out, right? But something like that. I'm sure I got the numbers wrong. I think it's like, first of all, digital transformation isn't really an end game anyway. Like that's not, you have to really articulate, first of all, what does that mean for your company? Because I see some companies and be like, we're doing digital transformation. Oh, okay. What does that mean? We're putting everything in containers. Like, I mean, that's not a business outcome.
Right. We're lifting and shifting to the cloud.
Exactly. So I think there's a problem with just figuring out what the right outcomes are to aim for. But I think there's some structural stuff. Like I think that companies are, I think we're still living in, we're in this digital era, but we're still following the paradigm of the 20th century manufacturing economy. So I've mentioned the word composable a lot. This is really where, when I'm talking to companies about digital transformation, I'm like, this is a structural change. And so you need to follow these patterns. If you look at the companies that grew up in the web era, like Amazon, right? They follow this more composable approach of saying small product teams supported by platform teams building these API enabled capabilities used in multiple contexts. So, you know, which is kind of what we've been architecturally promoting all along. But I think for a company to take full advantage, that needs to go right to that organizational level. So I think that what happens is companies will do sort of paper over with, well, we did a prototype of a project where we have a really good digital experience, but they're just papering over the structure that they already have. So I think it's hard, but to trying to get into the guts and change the guts, but that doesn't mean you blow everything up and start from scratch either. So, you know, I try and work with companies and give them a more iterative approach to make the structural changes one step at a time. And I think a lot of that does come down to breaking apart, understanding your business domains, understanding where your real core capabilities are, that value mapping thing I was talking about before, understand what you're doing better than everyone else and making sure that you're leveraging that as much as possible. Also understanding what you don't need to build yourself and divesting of that and using, there's so many, you know, best of breed capabilities out there that are behind APIs. So there's a lot of changes that have to happen, but I'd say fundamentally it's that companies aren't recognizing the structural differences in the digital paradigm versus the old paradigm. And then even if they do, being able to get there one step at a time. So it's hard work though. But I've seen some companies now that are doing it and doing it effectively, and that's pretty exciting.
Right. I think too there are opportunities in potential core domains, speaking domain-driven design parlance, but which don't exist today, right? And just since we're talking about banks, I mean, banks thinking in terms of, well, deposits is a core domain because it's so important to the bank. Well, that's true, but is that actually where innovation is coming from? I'm not saying that it can't, but in other words, are there ways that the bank can make money in new areas that are supported by deposits, for example, whatever, part of the bank that's considered. And should those be the areas of transformation? Just an idea.
Yeah.
Those, are there ways we can automate where we never did before?
Completely. And I think, banking is a tough one because they just make so much money in the banking industry that, it's hard to motivate them to really challenge themselves. But there's lots of innovation happening in the financial space. I think that
Well, here,
go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say, here's a really, big problem for banks, financial services, and that is having 50 to 100 million lines of code on mainframes.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, maybe even more. I don't know.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Easily.
So.
I think, and that's a different problem to the sort of innovation problem, but it's definitely gets in the way or can get in the way. But I think banking is an interesting one from that value exchange perspective, because what is it about bank? Like, what value are the banks providing? We know what value they're capturing, but I think a lot of it is trust. Like, a lot of the reason why people stick with their banks is because they've just, whether they are happy with them or not, they trust them with the money. And so, how much are banks leveraging that value proposition of being trusted? There's a lot of ways they could take it, and that's also something that we. I work with companies we have these workshops where we try and be practical, sort of pragmatic innovation, where we break down what are you doing today, and then look for 3 types of opportunities: unbundle, reach, extend, which is what can you carve out of what you're doing today to come up with a new opportunity? Who can you reach with what you're doing today and new audiences? And then how do you extend the experience or the process or optimize the process to make it better? And that framework has been really useful. It seems pretty obvious, but especially the unbundle one, you come up with some really interesting ones, like, oh, well, actually, like the banks, like, oh, we're really in our adjudication process, we're doing sort of our own credit scoring. Like, well, maybe you can become a credit bureau. Like, there's lots of places you can go. So,
well, it's been very interesting. If you were to provide one sort of encapsulating recommendations or direction that would help companies, and by and large, what would that be?
I think it's maybe again it may be obvious, but it's really always ask why. Right? There's so much. I've seen so many organizations who get down the chain of, we need to do this because of this, and then, well, we need to do this because of that. And they sort of lose sight of what the purpose was of what they're doing. Like I was picking on we're going to containerize everything thing, like whatever, especially if you're at the depths of IT and you're working on, big infrastructure initiatives, always challenge and ask, why are we doing this? Is this the right thing to do? What is the business outcome here? Because it's pretty easy there's so much complexity we're dealing with. It's pretty easy to go astray. And if you can't trace back what you're doing to how it's going to help the business, then maybe you shouldn't be working on that. There's actually a group, our engineering group here, have done a whole effort of doing that tracing of saying, here's what we're aiming for, here's our North Star, and then showing all, for everyone in the engineering organization can see what they're working on, how it traces back to the North Star. And that's actually a motivator too. So it can be energizing to really think about what you're doing. So that would be it. Always ask why.
Good. So, thank you for taking time to meet with us. Any sort of parting thoughts beyond the asking why that you'd like to say? How should people reach you if they want to learn about your new effort of trying to show the value chain?
Feel free to find me on LinkedIn or Twitter, Matt McLarty, BC. I'm actually presenting at API Days conference later today, interface conference. So I'm out there. Always love to hear from people, and I like to give ideas to people who will follow through as well. So look forward to talking.
Yeah.